Now the entering second chapter, HIHANTEKI-IRYŌ, a critical medicine. I began to study medical history, including its history of ideas, or intellectual history, sociology, economics, ethics, and anthropology. On correcting these subdisciplines, Professors Nakagawa invented a neologism, medical humanities, for which he contrasted with biomedicine. In his sense, there were two cultures in the studies of medicine, medical humanities and biomedicine. He used biological medicine to refer to the narrow scientific medicine. These terms were like C.P. Snow's book, Two Cultures, published in 1959. He used to divide two categories, the science and the humanities. I think Nakagawa sensei's idea of the dichotomy between medical humanities and biomedicine seem to be sui generis because the Japanese medical authorities used the completely different dichotomy between basic and clinical medicine and or between clinical and social medicine. All these dichotomy sought belonged along one just of scientific medicine, biomedicine, or natural sciences, 生物医学 or 自然科学. We never had medical humanities as an integrated discipline. The only exception was medical historiography, for example, the work of Fujikawa Yu. But I think that this academic work budded from amateur science was not an integrated discipline to university curriculum. Now, I will back to Nakagawa sensei personal history relating with ethos that we have shared. Dr. Nakagawa and his disciples share a similar ethos. It's ethos that means distinctive spirit of a subculture against social control by medical establishment. We thought that all the social institutions could be erroneous in their treatment in patient. We remembered that Nakagawa sensei used to say, all types of medical treatment have attribute of experiment. For example, giving a trial and error aspect, or while the object of medicine is a human being, therefore, we can say that all medical treatment as a human experiment. The quote end. Dr. Nakagawa was born in Seoul of Korean Peninsula, the colonial town of the Japanese Empire in 1926. He was fostered as a pro-militarism boy. He said after 6 years later, but he was shocked when that defeated imperial army was finally defeated. After 1945, during his medical student period in Kyoto Imperial University until 1947, then in Kyoto University, he had drastically converted into something liberalist. After his graduation, he participated in a voluntary party called seinen Kagakushika Shudan, young group of historians of science in the 1960s. This was after the political movement against Nichibei Anpo, the US-Japan military alliance conflict of the 1960s. In period of young radicals in campuses during the conflict at the end of 1960s and the beginning of 1970s, our elder colleagues among the Maoists had radical experience as university undergraduate student, but I was part of later generation falling behind the time. So to say it simply, I was in part of post-festum after the feast generation, because I was born in 1956, was a 4-year-old boy. As 4-year-old boy, I was too young to understand the politics in 1960s of the first renovation, Nichibei Anpo. Even 10 years later, I was still too young. After 14 years old kids, I participate in the struggle of university student in 1970. In this scene, Western means political disturbance. So I was in an in-between generation of two big political feasts. Why did dozens of students sharing the same ethos against social control by establishment gather around Professor Nakagawa, who was part of an older generations? Because there were no other social space where young students could talk freely about in this topic. This was true not only in Kansai, Western Japan, but also throughout Japan. There were two major academic currents for studying medical history at the beginning of 1970s. One was Thomas Kuhn's, and the other was Orthodox Marxism. His old friend, Dr. Shigeru Nakayama, translated Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolution, into Japanese in 1971, 9 years after of original edition published in 1962. We could not accept fundamentally the Marxist theories, especially one of the Japanese Communist Party localized version, because they were too dogmatic in their analysis of medical practice, which always used the framework of labor processes. But at the same time, we had tolerance for the framework of Marxist theory, especially in the case of Western Marxism, which could be used to analyze how patients were alienated. The Kuhnian method of revolution, conversely, was attractive to us because we pursued a kind of paradigm change by inventing the medical humanities as opposed to the biology-dominant medicine, biomedicine. Until 1980, Dr. Nakagawa was an associate professor that had no chance of being promoted above this position. When he was finally promoted to professorship, he was 54 years old. I am now 3 years later older than him. He had the charisma to be our spiritual guru and best theorist for medical humanities, like our Western heroes that I mentioned before. His personal character was that a good egalitarian, unlike any other professor in the Faculty of Medicine. He had great tolerance and never dialected in magisterial style when he would comment on our research representations. A senior student who had a medical doctor proposed to us his creative concept of HIHANTEKI-IRYŌ, the critical medicine. We welcomed this conception of him. It helped us develop our position that would take us away from social control by medical establishment and toward the laboratory oppressed people. We were charmed easily by this dogma of critical medicine. At that time, there were a dozen of key concepts for constructing a medical theory for liberalism in Western medicine, e.g., anti-psychiatry, illness labeling theory, a series of negative aspects of modern medicine, total institutions, involuntary hospitalizations, professional dominance, medicalization, iatrogenesis, victim blaming, and also Foucauldian concept of panopticon, anatomopolitique, and biopower, etc. But today, I regret that we had very naive political thinking and believed that all medical institutions would be simply oppressive anyway. We were too idealistic to make concrete plan to reform the conservative medical system. At that time, we encountered Professor Margaret Rock's paper in Japanese entitled Ryosai Kenbo no Teiko, resisting against becoming a good wife and wise mother, published in Kikan Jinrui-gaku, Anthropology Quarterly, volume 15, number 1, page from 36 to 60, published in 1984. At least for me, it was an amazing article because we wrote a sophisticated argument that took a critical approach to both the grand theory of Japanese women somatization and the newly emerging neologism of pseudo-disease, bogenbyō, and daidokoro shokogun. Bogenbyō can be translated into child illness induced by deficiency of mother's social responsibility on one side, and Daidokoro Shokogun can be translated into housewife kitchen syndrome. Both were very curious pseudo-disease terminology, even for Japanese. Her argument is very clear that concept of somatization could not only be necessary to know one of universal type of sociopathology, but we should to understand as a certain cultural representation of personal distress. I had just apprehended that her style of writing could be needed to create our medical anthropology, HIHANTEKI-IRYŌ, critical medicine. Unfortunately, I have no time to do so because I should leave from Japan to Honduras, Central America, for volunteer work in a rural public health program from 1984 to 1987. In Honduras, during the first year, I worked in a malaria prevention program, and for final 2 years in rural health program in Western Honduras. After arriving in Central America, under the political atmosphere of Cold War, I touched seriously to preach the importance of medical anthropology for Honduran health workers. Needless to say that that was a losing battle. Although I was serious, they felt that my idea was bizarre because they thought that it was useless to introduce my cultural representative approach to rural public health program. They were satisfied with their own work. They would not have they did not have a comparative perspective to need better, good life for rural people. They did not even care if rural people achieved good health. The public health work was only work for minimum wage. So I abandoned by preaching and my plan to introduce medical anthropology to them. And then I studied myself to do field work on traditional folk medicine, commoditizations of rural health, and medicalization process. For the purpose of writing academic paper, after returning to Japan, I began publishing a series of papers on medical anthropology based on my rural fieldwork experience. But it took more than 14 years before published my first health practice in rural Honduras. So end of chapter 2.